Hello. It's been quite a while now since I've made a video on domestic British politics. The only reason being is that there's been a lot of interesting things happening around the world, and so much of domestic British politics has been dominated by Brexit, and there's only so much that can be said about that. It's done now. Um, and I really think that Brexit can only be judged with the passage of time. I do believe that. Because depending what camp you're on, there's good news and there's bad news all the time. So I really do think that can only be judged by the passage of time. Um, but I do want to talk a little bit about Keir Starmer and the situation the Labour Party is in right now. Um, he actually has the title of Sir Keir Starmer. I understand he doesn't personally use it. Um, so Starmer's now been in his role for about 10 months. Let me just say a disclaimer here before getting into the rest of the video, or a caveat perhaps. I think that being leader of the opposition in this country is a very, very difficult job because it's a constant balancing act. Some people have this idea that all the opposition leader has to do is criticise. They don't have any responsibility and they don't have to govern. Well, it's true an opposition leader doesn't have the same pressures as a prime minister or his or her cabinet. It's a different dynamic in that sense. Nevertheless, by its very nature, a credible opposition has to show that it is potentially an opposition fit for government. Therefore, every day is kind of like a job interview for an opposition party. Um, the pandemic has perhaps given Starmer some leeway insofar as parliamentary business is a bit different from normal. The Commons is a lot quieter than usual, with social distancing and so on, and that kind of takes away the Punch and Judy aspect to a large extent, which might be a good thing actually. That might be, not entirely a bad thing. Um, my own take on Starmer's performance so far is somewhat mixed. But I've just read an interesting column in the Times, um, and it's worth remembering that the Times supported New Labour in 1997 under Tony Blair. And of course, he's a man I will be coming back to in this video. It's very hard to talk about the Labour Party without mentioning Blair, and that will become obvious in a minute. Um, so this column by Matthew Paris was basically entitled "Voters Will Not Be Swayed by Labour's Mr. Timid." So he was arguing that Starmer is too cautious, and it was an interesting write-up. It was an interesting write-up. Um, Starmer's performance as leader, he came into a very difficult position. This was a party that had lost two general elections in a row under Jeremy Corbyn, a party that was beset by bitter infighting, probably the worst since the 1980s, and a party that was dealing with very serious anti Semitism allegations with very credible evidence. Starmer had to deal with all those things. As well as demonstrate his own credentials. He never had major competition in the leadership race. I think he was always going to be number one. Um, I have to say, at the time, I thought Lisa Nandy might be kind of a credible centrist figure. I'm disappointed in her since. I think just become yet another woke agitator, frankly. Some of her statements recently have just been ridiculous. But this isn't about Lisa Nandy. This is about Keir Starmer. Um, Starmer has some strong points as leader. He was clever not to uh, sort of jump into the temptation to become kind of the anti-Brexit opposition leader. And many people on the pro-European segment of the Labour Party and perhaps in the country want Starmer to do that. But he became leader in April 2020. We left the EU in January. Um, Keir Starmer is not a fool. He might be a lot of things, but the man is not stupid, and I think he knows full well that if he pushes against what many Labour Party voters, including in my city, um, voted for, it might please the sort of metropolitan aspect or pro-European aspect of the party, but would definitely polarise and anger those Labour voters who went for Brexit. And after all, Keir Starmer's major challenge, alongside all the other things, is to win back those, Labour voters who went to Boris Johnson's Conservatives in December 2019. Um, so politically speaking, I think it's sensible for Starmer not to make Brexit an issue, not to become sort of the anti-Brexit Labour leader. It's clever also because Boris Johnson and the Tories can't then paint him as being a sore loser or a remoaner because they've tried to. Though, that was a Tory strategy early on to try and paint Starmer as this elitist remoaner lawyer. That's fallen flat because Starmer has barely mentioned Brexit in the context of anti-Brexitism. So that's very smart of Starmer, I think, because he knows that he needs to respect the views of those millions of Labour voters who voted for Brexit. Um, so politically, that's smart. The thing about the Labour Party is it's a very difficult job because I mentioned that the job of an opposition leader is difficult. It's particularly difficult, I think, for a Labour leader. And that, after all, most opposition leaders are Labour leaders. In my lifetime, only 13 years of my lifetime have been led by Labour government. The other 23 years have been a Tory government or Tory coalition government. So, in that sense, the Tories are the natural party of power, Labour is a natural party of opposition. Um, But Keir Starmer has this real balancing act because the Labour Party is a huge party. I understand, and I might be wrong about this, but by membership, it's actually Europe's largest political party, and that would probably make it one of the world's biggest political parties by membership. Probably in the top 20 or 30, I would say, in terms of membership. It's the biggest in Europe, and that's significant because within such a large membership base, you're going to have a lot of tribes and a lot of opinions. Not healthy in a democracy, but it can cause a headache for a party leader because it's a balancing act. Something similar is going on right now with the Democrats in the United States, but I don't want to talk too much about that because I want to focus here on Starmer. Um, and he looks like a man who's very much trying to balance things out. So on one hand, he appeared in this video in front of the Union Jack. On the other hand, he took the knee last year in support of Black Lives Matter. So that says to me this is a man who's trying to pander to both sides of the party, i.e., the kind of woke left who are very pro Black Lives Matter and really want Starmer to be frankly more woke, and that is literally what they say. They want him to be more woke. And then the other side, which insists that patriotism isn't a dirty word. But I think it's an indicator of where Labour is at. That the very fact that a man who is aspiring to be Prime Minister appears in front of our national flag as some sort of source of controversy, that shows where Labour is at, where a large segment of the Labour Party actually see that as controversial. Lord Mandelson made a good point. Someone who aspires to lead the country, or a party that aspires to lead the country, surely it's a no-brainer that they should love the country. But, I had an interesting discussion on a debate forum last week about patriotism versus nationalism, and I don't want to span that out too much. That's for another video. But I do think that healthy patriotism is just that, it's healthy. I've always said that, love of one's country, wanting to serve one's country, caring about one's country, and particularly, ownership of the Union Jack shouldn't be down to the far right. So surely it's a good thing, and this is what I would say to those people who claim it's jingoism. Surely it is a good thing that moderate people reclaim the Union Jack from racists, from the hard right. Is that not a good thing? Um, I do think that Starmer's taking the knee last year was a mistake. I understand why he done it, because there's very loud voices in the Labour Party that demand that sort of thing. But I think it was a mistake because Black Lives Matter as a movement is, we don't know what direction it's going to go in. There are absolutely some extreme elements within this movement um, who want some very totalitarian overtures in terms of their what they want to see happen. I'm not just talking about disbanding the police. I'm talking about policing microaggressions and all sorts of things. It's easy to dismiss woke nonsense, but there are real world implications of this. Um, in contrast, you had Foreign Secretary who got heat for saying he wouldn't take the knee. When Dominic Raab said that, he got a backlash from, not surprisingly, the woke left. Um, and this week, Priti Patel has been absolutely lambasted by the likes of The Guardian and The Independent for her criticism of Black Lives Matter. But actually, that's probably, as a conservative minority Home Secretary, that's probably going to win her a lot of fans. Quite frankly, I'm pleased that there are powerful people starting to say, well, actually, we don't have to pander to this movement. We don't have to just tell them what they want to hear. But the leader of the Labour Party is never going to criticise Black Lives Matter. Um, One thing Starmer has on his side, he will never be Jeremy Corbyn. You will never see Keir Starmer call terrorist organisations our friends. And Corbyn apologists can say what they want, but Jeremy Corbyn said it. Okay, that's not some sort of right wing smear or fake news or anything else. He said it. Okay, um, and I really feel that Corbynites are on the wrong side of history, a bit like Trump supporters. Ironically, they're really two sides of the same coin. Um, they may think their politics are radically different, but in some ways they're two sides of the same coin. They both rail against so-called globalists. Um, they both are prone to sort of anarchy and conspiracy theories and bigotry as well. In the case of Corbynites, you know, the only human rights concerns they have is when it comes to Israel. When it comes to the rest of the world, they're silent. But I could talk all day about my issues with Corbynism. I won't do that because Corbyn's the past. Um, well, I say it's the past, but here's the problem. The Corbynite legacy is very much there, and Starmer can't just kick them out unless they actually break party rules. And even then, he can't just make that decision independently. It's, as I understand it, with Labour's rules, it's down to the National Executive Committee. The leader only has so much power. Um, but here's the irony with the Labour Party. In my lifetime, there have been 8 Labour leaders. I'm including Margaret Beckett. She was technically an interim leader, but I'll include her. 8 Labour leaders. 2 of them were Prime Minister, and only one of those 8 leaders can really be said to have been electorally successful. Um, Miliband done okay in 2015. It wasn't a massive loss, but Tony Blair is the only Labour leader in my lifetime who really was electorally successful. Now that's saying something. And the irony of that is he is also the one person who so many people in the party want to distance themselves from. Now, I am not saying that Keir Starmer should be another Tony Blair. Blair made some big mistakes, and he did polarize a lot of his party. But there is no escaping the fact that what Tony Blair done, I should say Tony Blair's government, it wasn't him alone, um, was bring a party that was seen as unelectable and bring it back to the fore of British politics and serve as Prime Minister for 10 years. You can't scoff at Blair's achievements. This is what I don't understand about the Labour Party. One man, the one Prime Minister who was so successful, is kind of like, you know, he who we will not mention. Now, Tony Blair's the past as well. I understand that. I am not saying that Starmer should just be Tony Blair Mark II. He's his own man. Um, but what history shows, and this is something the Labour left do not grasp, this country, we may have been the world's first industrial nation, and therefore, the history of working class Britain can never ever be downplayed. The history of labour rights in this country can never be downplayed, and the importance of the trade union movement and all those sort of socialist values cannot be downplayed. But at an electoral level, the British people will never vote for a hard left party. They just won't. It's never happened. Not at government level. There may have been examples where, the left has done quite well, but that's natural in a democracy. There's always going to be a honeymoon period for both the government and the leader of the opposition at different times. Um, but the only time that Labour has ever won is by going to the centre. You know, Attlee and Wilson may have been more to the left than Blair, but they certainly weren't hard left. Um, so I really think that that's something Corbyn faction just don't grasp. I really do think that they want to be in opposition. I really do, because their natural comfort zone is protest. Their natural comfort zone is denouncing white privilege and imperialism and all the rest of it. And I have to say, I find it ironic when that faction of the left accuse conservatives of waging culture wars. That's preposterous, because when conservatives get on the defensive about statues, it's only because those left-wing activists demand that statues be torn down. They're the ones waging the culture war, and they're putting their conservative critics on the defence. So it's preposterous to say that it's conservatives who are waging the culture war. Um, what Starmer really needs to do is a lot of the things he's been doing, holding the government to account. I certainly don't think he's a disastrous leader. I think he has got some strengths. He's smart. He does his homework on important issues. In many ways, he's a better um, debate performer than Johnson. Um, I do still believe he shouldn't be written off. Far from it. And the very fact that he's only been in the job 10 months and already, he's having these question marks just shows how difficult that job is. But I guess Blair had the advantage of the fact that the Tories had been in power for so long, people were fed up with them. And it may well be that in 1997 people voted for New Labour not necessarily enthusiastically, but because they were so fed up with the Tories. That's possible. But nevertheless, Tony Blair, Mandelson, and other New Labour figures knew how to utilise that. And that was very smart. Um, I suppose Neil Kinnock would get some credit for that as well. He sort of laid some of the groundwork of New Labour. Um, but it's so important that the country does have a strong opposition. Um, but we're in a strange situation here because this is the biggest crisis this country's faced since World War II. And although bashing politicians and bashing the government is kind of a national sport in this country, I think that even people who are not usually pro-Tory genuinely have sympathy for Boris Johnson's position. I mean, he really has had a time of it. This has been a very turbulent decade in this country with referendums and a lot of things that have been happening. 4 general elections, 3 referendums in the 2010s. It was a very turbulent time. 3 prime ministers, 4 prime ministers, in fact, in that decade, from Brown to Johnson. Um, so with Boris Johnson, I mean, On the surface, he was kind of Mr. Brexit, and it would ostensibly be his honeymoon period because he left the EU. But then he's had to deal with this awful, awful pandemic. And so I feel that people genuinely sympathize with him, even though there's been over 100,000 dead. There hasn't been a revolution. There hasn't been like how awful that this has happened on his watch. It's kick him out of office. I definitely think there's frustrations with the government and a lot of legitimate criticism. I think there's been mixed messages. I think the lockdowns probably came too late. I think there's a lot of things that the government could have done differently. But there is a caveat to that. For example, the mortality figures. A lot of countries around the world are not, I don't think their figures are accurate. I think Britain actually, our research agencies, I forget what the main one is now, I believe it's, it eludes me right now, but I think we have some of the most accurate data in the world, actually. Um, Many developing countries, so for example, Afghanistan has reported only 2,500 COVID deaths. I've just read another report in the Times that the true figure could be 50,000. And that's replicated all over the developing world and also in totalitarian states. So when we're looking at this in retrospective, I think that it might be like the 1918 influenza. I think the total world toll, and this is going to sound very dystopian, is going to be a lot higher than the 2.3 million it currently is, and that's awful. But it also means that Johnson's kind of legacy of COVID will be judged in a less critical way because people will see what the international context was. So, for example, right now we are what the fourth or fifth highest death toll in the world. But if the true figures were looked at, I think we wouldn't be that high. I mean, I'm not downplaying it. This is horrendous, horrendous. And I definitely think some of the double standards, mixed messages, and so on from the government hasn't helped. But that's the problem that Starmer has. Um, if he's too critical of the Prime Minister on COVID, people might think he's just criticizing for the sake of it. Yet that is his job. It is his job to criticize and hold the government to account. But he's been quite smart in terms of saying that, well, we support the government, we will say so. That is responsible and it does warrant respect. Anyway, I'm going to round this up soon because it's late, but every opposition leader has this period where their leadership is questioned. I think if Labour really does aspire to be in government, they certainly need to hold on to Starmer, but Keir Starmer himself really does need to get this balance right. The overtures to patriotism, I frankly think he and his advisors should ignore those woke voices because, I mean, I understand the risk. They could cause a headache within the party. This is not the appetite that the wider public has. I really think if you've done a poll in the street, and this is just my conjecture, I can't prove this, but if you've done a poll saying to someone on the street, do you believe that Black Lives Matter as a concept? 99% of people would say, of course. If you say, do you support Black Lives Matter, the movement? I think you'll find a lot of people would be quite critical. I really do. Okay, maybe in London and certain parts of London that ratio would be different, but it's my conjecture. But I really think that it's a misconception that just because a particular movement is loud, that represents wider sentiments. And that's why so many people are backing Priti Patel. When I looked at the LBC report, literally every comment, or a good 80% of them, I would say, were backing the Home Secretary's position. So Starmer has this kind of balancing act. Does he pander to the woke left of the party, or does he pander to the regular Labour voter, um, who isn't like a university student or a sort of left wing activist, but is just a regular Jill or Joe Labour voter? Um, that's not to say that they're particularly right wing, but I really don't think that they are interested in identity politics. You know, A white Labour voter in Grimsby or Sunderland or Blackpool doesn't want to be lectured about the white privilege. They want to know about food prices, about the approach to COVID, about jobs. Those are the sort of bread and butter issues that Labour need to focus on. Because really, these sort of culture wars and identity politics, they're important, but they really are not what most people think about, in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts.